I should have come down before dark closed in. I didn't. I stayed too long on the upper stretch of the slope tracking a deer that led nowhere, and by the time I realized the light was fading too fast, the cabin was the only sensible option. I've known that place for about 12 years. Used it 3 times, always just passing through, always one night only. Old structure, wood that's been worked too hard, but a solid roof, and a fireplace that still catches. For one night, it does the job. The path there is about 40 minutes through the valley, following the creek to the tight bend where the pines grow crooked from the north wind that comes down in winter. I can do that stretch in the dark if I have to. I've done it. I know every stone, every root that juts out of the ground in the wrong place. So I went along the creek. The water was low for the time of year, and the sound it made was thinner than it should have been. A shallow, whispering thing ticking against loose rock. I heard that, and I heard my own footsteps, and I heard the wind up in the canopy. Nothing else. That's when I stopped. There's no right word for what I felt. It's not fright, not a chill, not anything you can explain to someone who hasn't spent enough time in the woods. It's when you realize the place has gone quiet in a way it shouldn't be. Not quiet because the wind died or because it's too cold. Quiet because everything living out there decided not to make a sound. Not one bird. No mice in the dry brush. No squirrel rustling on a branch. The forest was holding its breath. I've seen this before. A mountain lion does it in those first few minutes before it moves. A bear does it sometimes when it's too close and the wind is wrong. It's the silence of something watching you. I kept walking, but differently. Slow, barely lifting my feet, my left hand already on the barrel of the shotgun. I hadn't cocked it yet, just held on. The smell hit me about 100 yards from the cabin. Wet fur, strong, heavy. The kind of smell that sits in the back of your throat. Not bear. Bear has a rancid, greasy earth smell I know well. Not deer. Not elk. Fur, yes, but with something underneath it that doesn't match anything I've ever put my nose near. I stopped again. Took 2 slow, deep breaths. The smell didn't fade, didn't shift. It hung in the air like whatever was making it wasn't moving either. I cocked the shotgun right there in the middle of the path without a sound. The cabin came through the trees the way it always does. A dark square more solid than the darkness around it. The roof with that crooked slope on the right side where a heavy snow some winter back caved in the beam. I made it to the door without seeing anything. Didn't hear anything. The smell was stronger near the east wall, the one that faces the thick brush, but I couldn't see what was making it. I went in. Locked up. The cabin has a main room with a fireplace. A back room that's good for nothing. 1 window in front and 1 on the side. The windows have old wooden shutters, the kind that latch from inside with a rusted iron bar. I shut both. Didn't light the fireplace yet. Fire makes smoke, smoke rises. And I didn't want to announce anything beyond what was already announced. I stood in the middle of the room with the shotgun and waited. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. I started thinking it was a bear passing through, that the smell had hung in the air longer than the animal had, that I'd stopped in a quiet forest by coincidence and let my head run too far with it. It's happened before. A man spends too long alone in the woods. He starts filling the silence with things that aren't there. Then it leaned against the wall. Not a knock, not a scratch, not the kind of sound an animal makes when it bumps into something by accident. It was the slow, deliberate contact of a large weight settling against the wood, like it was resting there, like it knew it could. I felt the pressure from the other side. Didn't see it, but there's a spot in that wall that gives a little when you push, and that spot gave. From the outside, I aimed the shotgun at the wall and didn't fire. I still didn't know what it was. I needed to know before I spent a shell. I have 6. 6 shells for a night I don't know how long is going to last, in a cabin that wasn't built to hold pressure from the outside. The weight pulled away from the wall after a while. I heard the footsteps, heavy, evenly spaced, bipedal, moving toward the front window. I stopped breathing. The shutter isn't thick. The light outside was only what the night gives back of itself, almost nothing, but enough to cast a shadow. The shadow appeared in the gap of the shutter. Tall. Wide at the shoulders in a way that doesn't match a bear standing up, doesn't match an elk, doesn't match anything I've ever seen standing upright in these mountains. It held there long enough for me to count my own breath 8 times. Then it was gone. And it was the way it disappeared that scared me more than everything that had come before. The problem with not knowing where something is that you start hearing it everywhere. I stood in the middle of the room for a stretch of time I can't properly measure. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been more. When you're like that, shotgun in hand, ears straining against the silence, time stops behaving the way it's supposed to. Every second has a different weight. Some pass quickly, most don't pass at all. I didn't hear anything else from outside. That didn't settle me. I learned a long time ago that absence of sound isn't absence of something. Sometimes it's the opposite. What moves slowly and with intention doesn't need to make noise. It chooses not to. I went to the front window without turning on my flashlight. The shutter has a gap in the lower right corner where the wood rotted a little and split open about 2 finger widths. I crouched down, pressed my face to that gap, and looked outside. Pine trees. Darkness between the trunks. The creek too far away to hear from here. Nothing moving. Nothing I could make out standing or crouching near the trees. But the smell was still there, coming in through the same gap my eye was using. Wet fur and that layer underneath I can't name. Stronger now than when I'd been outside. I went back to the center of the room. I counted the shells again, not because I didn't know the number, but because I needed something to do with my hands. 6. 2 in the chamber, 4 in the right pocket of my vest. The shotgun is a Remington 870. I've been using for 15 years, 12-gauge short barrel I had modified a few years back to make it easier to handle inside a truck and in thick brush. Not a precision weapon at distance. It's a house weapon, a dense woods weapon. A weapon for when the thing is close enough that you don't need to aim much. Close enough. I kept thinking about that. The shadow I'd seen in the shutter had been right outside the window, which meant it was maybe 2 feet away from me when it showed up. 2 feet of old wood and rotted shutter between me and whatever that was. I could have fired through the gap. Could have put both shells from the chamber straight into that shadow, and maybe ended things right there. I didn't fire because I didn't know what it was. I still don't. I know what it isn't. Not a bear. The posture was wrong, too upright, shoulders too high. The silhouette tapered from top to bottom in a way a standing bear doesn't taper. Not an elk, not a deer. I rule those out without thinking. A man doesn't smell like that and doesn't carry that kind of volume. I kept trying to fit it into a catalog I've spent my whole life building. Every animal I've ever tracked, seen, heard, followed for miles through the woods, and it didn't fit anything. The catalog has no entry for what was outside my window. That's what weighs the most. Not the size, not the smell, not the shadow. It's not having a name to put to it. About 40 minutes after the shadow disappeared, the sounds came back. This time from the right side of the cabin, the wall that backs directly up against thick brush with no space between the wood and the first trees. It wasn't the same slow, pressing contact as before. It was a sequence of touches. Not knocks, not scratches. Something more subtle, like something was running its hands along the outside of the wood, testing joint by joint, hand width by hand width, moving upward from the bottom until it reached a height I estimated at just over 6.5 feet before stopping. I stared at that wall, like I could see through it. The wood there is worse than anywhere else in the cabin. There's a section in the middle third, where the boards were replaced once, maybe 20 years back, and the new wood never sat right against the old. It left a joint that shifts when the temperature drops. I know this because I've slept here in the fall and listened to that wall making noise on its own all night. But what was making noise now wasn't the temperature. The touches stopped. Silence again. Then came a sound I hadn't heard yet. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic. Coming out through the nose, the kind of breathing a large animal makes after physical effort, wet enough that I could picture the breath condensing in the cold air outside. It lasted a short while, less than a minute, and it came from a height that confirmed what the shadow had already told me. This thing is standing upright and it's tall. I aimed the shotgun at the wall and held there. I didn't fire. Old wood isn't going to stop something that size if it decides to actually come through. And I didn't want to find that out by wasting a shell on a blind shot. I need an angle. I need a reasonable distance. I need to see what I'm shooting at. The breathing went away. The touches didn't come back. I went to the side window this time, the one right beside that bad wall, and looked through the gap along the frame. The wood doesn't close right there. It leaves a vertical space about 3 fingers wide on the right side, if you push the shutter gently to the left. I pushed. It was there. Outside, less than 3 feet from the window, facing the cabin. Still, looking at me. Or looking at the window, I can't say for certain, but its head was turned in my direction. As big as I'd thought. Bigger, maybe. The shoulders were easily wider than any man I've ever seen. The thick neck disappeared into a broad skull with an elongated snout, and the arms hung down almost to the knees even with the body fully upright. I looked at it. It looked at me. Then it turned to the side slowly, without any hurry at all, and walked into the darkness between the pines until it was gone. And I stood there with the shotgun in my hand, staring at the spot where it had been, trying to convince my mind that my eyes had been working right. I stayed at the gap until my vision started lying to me. When you force your eye on a dark point for too long, the darkness starts to move. Shapes that don't exist take on edges, still shadows seem to breathe, and your brain begins filling in what your eyes can't actually see. I know that phenomenon. I've spent nights waiting inside thick brush for an animal that never showed, and I've learned to recognize when I'm seeing things that aren't there. I stepped back from the window. What I'd seen before stepping back was real. That I knew. It wasn't the dark playing tricks, wasn't my head running too hard after a rough night. I'd seen it clearly enough to hold on to details I didn't make up. The width of the shoulders, the long arms, the way it turned sideways before leaving. Slow, unhurried, as if walking away was a choice and not a retreat. I went to the fireplace. I decided to start a fire. Not for the warmth, though the cold was starting to come in through the gaps in a way I could already feel in my fingers. I lit it because I needed light, needed to see the inside of the cabin clearly, needed to stop guessing at what was 2 feet away from me in the dark. The fireplace has good draw, the smoke goes straight up, and outside he already knew I was here anyway. There was nothing left to hide. The wood I'd left stacked next to the fireplace the last time I passed through was still there, covered with a piece of tarp. Dry. The fire caught fast. With the light, the cabin felt smaller. That's not an illusion. It's what fire does to a closed space. The shadows get pushed into the corners and stay there, and you see the inside better but lose the outside, because your eyes adjust to the light, and the darkness beyond the walls goes more opaque. I knew that when I lit it. I accepted the trade. I'd rather see the inside of the cabin clearly than see both poorly at the same time. I sat on the floor, back to the fireplace, facing the door, shotgun across my lap. I kept thinking about the way it moved. It wasn't the movement of a cornered animal. A cornered animal backs away fast, still facing the threat, keeping its eyes on the danger until it has enough distance to feel safe. It did the opposite, turned sideways without any rush, as if I wasn't enough of a threat to deserve attention during its exit. It left the way someone leaves a place they're planning to come back to. That stayed with me more than the size of it. I tried to estimate its weight from the sound of its footsteps on the hard ground outside. Packed soil, little gravel, the layer of pine needles absorbs some of it, but not everything. The steps were heavy enough to hear from inside, with the fire crackling. 250, maybe more. Maybe less if the build was denser than it was wide, which was how it seemed. Not a fat kind of bulk, a solid kind, the type of mass that goes forward when it decides to go. 2 hours after it disappeared into the pines, the cabin was quiet. I started monitoring the walls in a systematic way, the way I learned to read territory on a long hunt, not fixating on any one spot, letting my eyes move slowly around the perimeter, stopping where something pulled my attention. Front wall, right side wall, the back wall where the useless room sits, left side wall, front window, side window. I repeated that cycle more times than I can count. Nothing for a long stretch. Then it came back from the front. I didn't hear the footsteps approaching, which meant it was coming in slow, or the ground between the trees was absorbing more than I'd figured. The first sign was the smell coming through the gap in the front shutter, stronger than before. The wet fur and that layer underneath that fills your nose in a way you can't ignore. Then came the shadow, bigger against the shutter this time because it was closer, nearly against the wall, the silhouette blocking out most of the little bit of light the night had been letting through the wood. I stood up slowly, went to the gap in the lower right corner. It was less than 18 inches from the window, facing me, head tilted slightly to one side, looking at the shutter with an attention I can't describe any other way. Attention. Not the blank stare of an animal that stumbled up to an unfamiliar surface, not the anxious agitation of a predator that wants inside and doesn't know how. There was a focus in that gaze that made me step back once before I realized I was doing it. I saw its hand this time. It pressed against the shutter carefully. No force, no intent to break through. The wide palm, the long fingers ending in something I can't call claws without sounding dramatic. But that wasn't a fingernail either. They moved along the edge of the shutter from top to bottom, stopping at the joints, testing where the wood held firm and where it gave. Slowly, with a patience that doesn't belong to a hungry animal, I fired. Not through the shutter, not with it 18 inches away. If the shutter didn't stop anything, the wood shrapnel would go the wrong direction and I'd blow my position. I slammed the barrel of the shotgun against the wall, a hard, sharp bang, and shouted once. The kind of shout you put out to startle a large animal that's gotten too close. It didn't back off. The hand stopped moving for about 3 seconds. The head straightened. It looked at me, at the wall, through the wall at me, I can't say for certain, but all the attention was pointed this way. Then, with the same calm as before, it pulled its hand away from the shutter, took one step back, and stood still in the same spot, just a little further out. I watched it through the gap for a while. It stayed where it was, looking at the cabin, not moving, not making a sound. Standing out there like the cold didn't reach it, like the night was its natural place and the cabin was the thing that didn't belong. Then it disappeared again. I didn't hear which way it went. And I was left with 5 shells, a fire burning low, and the certainty that it hadn't left. It had just stopped showing itself, which is different, and I knew that better than I would have liked. There's something I learned early, before any hunt worth telling about. Whoever reads the animal controls the situation, not whoever has the bigger gun, not whoever runs faster, not whoever yells louder. Whoever understands what the animal is going to do before it does, it has the advantage, always. I've spent 50 years building that. The ability to watch behavior, identify patterns, anticipate the next move. It's what makes me useful as a guide. It's what's kept me alive in situations that shouldn't have ended well. I decided to use it. If it was studying me, I was going to study it back, with more method than I'd been using up to now, which was basically standing around waiting for the next scare. I needed information. How long it stayed gone between appearances, which direction it came back from, whether the return point varied or followed some logic, whether it responded to stimulus or ignored it. I needed to stop reacting and start actually observing. I pulled out the small notebook I carry in the inner pocket of my vest. I use it to jot down tracks, behavior, weather conditions on long hunts. Never figured I'd be using it for this. I wrote down the estimated time of each appearance that had happened so far, the point of contact, the duration, the behavior. It filled about half a page. I looked at it trying to find regularity. There was some, not much, but some. It always came back from the front or the right side. Never from the back, never from the roof so far. The time between disappearances and returns varied, but no interval had stretched past 2 hours. When it appeared, it would stay a while, observe, and leave without forcing its way in. It hadn't made a real attempt to break through anything yet. That could change, but so far, that was the pattern. I decided to test something. I went to the side window, the one closest to the bad wall, and knocked on it 3 times with my fist. Sharp, rhythmic, deliberate. Then I went to the front window and did the same. I wanted to see if it responded to sound location, whether the noise drew it toward where I was or toward where I was going. I waited. About 15 minutes. Nothing. Then the smell came back stronger on the front side. Then footsteps. This time I heard them coming from the left, circling the cabin around the front. It was outside the front window before I'd finished processing that it was arriving. Faster than the last time. I went to the gap. It was there, even closer now, its snout nearly touching the shutter, its breath condensing in the cold and coming through the gap in wet bursts that hit my face. It looked at the gap, looked directly at the gap, not at the shutter in general, at the specific spot where my eye was, and held there for a long time. I stepped back from the gap. It had responded to the sound. It had located the source with a precision that unsettled me. It wasn't the behavior of an animal that heard a noise and went to investigate on instinct. It went straight to the point. It knew where I was inside the cabin before it even reached the window, and confirmed it when it got there. I wrote that down in the notebook. I tried something else. I went to the back corner, the farthest part of the cabin from the front window, and made noise there. I dragged the old wooden crate that sits against that wall and knocked it over on purpose, a crash that echoed inside the enclosed space. Then I moved out of the back and went to the front window before it had time to react. I looked through the gap. It wasn't there anymore. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, heading toward the back, toward the direction of the noise I'd made. I went to the side window and looked through the frame gap. I saw it pass, the silhouette crossing the space between the wall and the first trees, moving at a speed I hadn't expected from something that size, reaching the back of the cabin in less time than I'd calculated. It stopped. No sound from the back. It stood there for a moment. Then it came back, not straight to the front. It circled around the right side, passed by the side window slowly. I crouched down, moved away from the frame, stayed low in the corner, and went back to the front. Stopped in front of the front window. This time it didn't look at the window. It looked at the side, at where I'd been. I wrote another line in the notebook with the hand that wasn't holding the shotgun. The handwriting came out ugly, pressed too hard into the page. It was adjusting faster than I was. Every move I made to learn its behavior, it used to learn mine. I change position, it registers. I make noise in one spot to pull it away from another. It plays along and comes back knowing more than when it left. I've done this with animals before. I've never been the side that was losing. I stood in the center of the room for a while without doing anything. I thought about what I had. 6 shells. No, 5 now. 1 had been used. 5 shells. A cabin with 2 windows and a door. Walls that had already shown they weren't the main problem because it wasn't trying to break through. It was learning where to break through when it decided to do that. It hadn't decided yet. That was the only thing giving me anything close to time. I looked at the door. Iron latch, decent frame. The door wood is thicker than the walls. If it were going to come in somewhere, the door would be the second to last place I'd choose. The right side wall would be first. I went to that wall and stood on the inside of it, shotgun aimed at the wood, and waited. Outside I heard it move away from the front window. Footsteps going right. Stopping. The smell went strong on my side for a moment. Then nothing. Gone again, and I stood there with the shotgun pointed at a wall of old wood, knowing that the next time it showed up it would know a little more about me than I would have liked. The right side wall gave at 2 in the morning. I don't know the exact time. I don't have a watch and my phone lost signal before I even reached the cabin. But the fire had burned down pretty low and the cold inside was heavy enough that I could feel it in my ankles and ears, which is what happens to me past 2 o'clock at temperatures like that. I could be off by 30 minutes either way. Doesn't matter much. What matters is the sound the wall made. It didn't happen all at once. It started with that woodworking I already knew. The bad joint between the new board and the old one expanding in the cold, but faster than usual, and coming from low down, near the baseboard, where the wood stays damper in winter, and had already been showing dark staining along the edges when I checked it before dark. Then came the pressure. I felt it before I heard it, the kind of vibration that travels up through the floor and reaches the soles of your feet. Steady weight being applied from outside, concentrated on one point methodically. I moved to that wall. I stood about 6 feet back, shotgun up, and watched. The wood was moving. Not much, not enough to see with the naked eye, but enough that I could hear the nails working in the joints. A thin, continuous creaking that didn't stop. The pressure didn't increase or decrease. It was constant, calculated. The kind of force that isn't trying to break through all at once but is finding out how much the structure can take before it gives on its own. I stepped back one more pace. I thought about the 5 shells. I thought about the angle. If the wall gave there, it would open a gap in the lower third, near the baseboard, and it would have to crouch way down to get through, which meant it would be in a bad position for a second, bent over, before straightening up on the inside. That second was the best angle I was going to get in any entry scenario. The wood split. Not the whole gap, just one board, the middle one in the older section, which blew out of the joint with a dry crack and left a hole about a foot wide. Through it came immediately a blast of cold air and the smell, full and unfiltered now. Nothing between it and me. I saw the fingers. They came through the hole slowly, spread to either side testing the width of the gap, then pulled. The board above gave partially, opening the hole to about 20 inches. The forearm came through with it. I fired. 6 feet away, short barrel, full load. The impact inside the cabin was deafening. The recoil threw my shoulder back and I lost half a second getting my position back. The arm vanished from the hole immediately. Outside there was a sound. Not a scream. Not a howl. Nothing I could put into a known category. It was a short, guttural sound, closer to what a large animal makes when it takes an unexpected physical hit than anything resembling a human cry of pain. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then silence. I kept the shotgun aimed at the hole in the wall. Cold air poured through the gap without stopping. I counted 4 shells in my pocket, checked the chamber. 1 spent shell, 1 still inside. 5 total. Not 4. 5. Because I'd miscounted before because my head was running too slow for basic math. Didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd fired once and still had 5. The silence held for about 4 minutes. I know because I kept count. Not seconds, not precisely, but in cycles of controlled breathing. The kind of counting you use when you're in a waiting position and need something to anchor time. 4 minutes of complete silence from outside. No footsteps, no new smell, no contact with the wood anywhere on the cabin. Then I heard it at the back, not right away. It hadn't gone straight to the back after taking the shot, because I would have heard the movement. It had stayed somewhere quiet through those 4 minutes and then moved to the back, already unhurried, already with none of the sound of a wounded or disoriented animal. The contact with the back wall was the same as always. The wide palm moving along the wood from bottom to top, pausing at the joints, testing. I went to the center of the cabin. The hole in the side wall was there, open, letting in cold and smell and anything that decided to come through it. Not big enough for it to fit through, but big enough to worry about what could be widened. I grabbed the wooden crate from the back room, the one I'd knocked over earlier, and dragged it to the side wall, pushed it up against the hole. It wasn't going to hold anything with any real force, but it would cost an extra second to open, and an extra second was what I needed to get my angle. At the back, the pressure kept up. I went to look at the back wall. Sturdier than the side wall, no replaced section, but older overall. The kind of old that's past the point of being tough and into the point of being brittle. If it pushed there the right way, it wouldn't be the slow pressure that gave the wood. It would be impact. I stood in front of that wall with the shotgun. The pressure stopped. Footsteps moving right, circling to the side, passing the hole I'd blocked with the crate. I heard it stop there. The smell went strong again through the gap the crate didn't fully seal. Then continuing to the front. It was circling the cabin again. The full loop. I tracked the stops as I listened, back, right side, front, left side, back again. It was going around the full perimeter, but differently than before, stopping less time at each point now, as if it already had what it needed from each wall and was only confirming. It stopped at the right side longer, near the hole. I was standing on the inside of that hole with a wooden crate pushed against it and 5 shells, listening to it standing out there less than 3 feet away, and for the first time all night I couldn't control what I felt. It wasn't panic. It was something deeper and quieter than panic, the kind of thing that settles into your chest and sits heavy in your stomach. The simple, undramatic recognition that the situation was moving in a direction I didn't know how to reverse. Outside, it held still a while longer. Then it moved off again, and I stood there looking at the crate propped against the hole, knowing it wasn't going to hold a damn thing when it decided it had learned enough. It stayed gone for more than an hour this time. I know because the fire burned down enough that I needed to add more wood, and I do that about once an hour when I'm camping. It's a habit that's turned into an internal clock over the years. I added wood once without hearing anything outside. Added it again without hearing anything. An hour and a half, maybe 2, of complete silence around the cabin. I know what long silence does to your head. I've sat waiting on animals that never showed up more times than I can count. It's always the same process. At first you're sharp, every signal matters, your body is ready. After a stretch of nothing, staying sharp starts costing more than you can keep paying, and your head starts looking for a cheaper way out. It starts questioning what you saw. It starts offering smaller explanations for things that seemed big. It's not weakness. It's your brain trying to save energy, trying to get back to a world that makes more sense. I knew that, and I still let it happen a little. Not enough to open the door or put down the shotgun, but enough that part of my head started working against me, pitching smaller versions of what had happened that night. The hole in the wall was there. Real. The crate pushed against it was real. The spent shell was real. Those I couldn't reinterpret. But the rest, the size I'd estimated, the posture, the way it had looked directly at the gap where my eye was, the patience I'd read in the way its hand moved along the shutter. That's what my head tried to shrink, tried to turn into a big bear, into perception warped by darkness and cold and fear. I let my head try for a while. It's easier to fight an argument that's already been made than to keep waiting for it to show up. Then I went to the hole in the wall. I pushed the crate aside and looked through the gap. There was blood on the outside. Not much, not the kind of bleeding that tells you you've hit something vital. But there was a dark stain on the wood along the lower edge of the hole and a few drops on the ground, in the pine needles under the wall. Too dark to see well, but the smell left no question. Blood and wet fur mixed together, the iron of the blood cutting through underneath everything else. I'd hit something. I didn't know what. Arm, hand, shoulder. The forearm was inside when I fired, so it was probably the forearm. But a 12 gauge at 6 feet isn't surgical. It could have gone higher than I'd aimed. Didn't matter where. What mattered was that I'd hit it and it had come back anyway. Come back, circled the whole cabin, tested the back wall, stood beside the hole for a long stretch. The shot hadn't solved anything. It had informed it. I went back to the center of the room and pushed the crate against the hole again. The wood in the fireplace was burning low. I put in the last big piece I had within reach and looked at what was left in the pile beside it. Not much. Enough for maybe 2 more hours of a weak fire. After that, I'd have to choose between getting more wood from the back room, where I'd seen a small stack against the wall when I checked the cabin before dark, or letting the fire go out and working in the dark. The back room has an interior door, no window. It's safer than the main room in terms of exposure, but it's a space where I'd lose sight of the perimeter, no way to know what was happening along the front walls. I left that decision for when it became necessary. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall between the fireplace and the side window, a spot that gave me an angle on the door, the front window, and the right side wall all at once. The shotgun lay across my lap. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to give them a rest. They were burning from straining so long against the dark and the low smoke off the fire. I thought about my truck. It's parked at the end of the dirt road, about 4 miles from here. 4 miles of woods, no decent trail, no light, with whatever's out there somewhere between the cabin and that road. I thought about it not as an escape plan. Going out now would be the worst decision I could make in the dark, not knowing where it was, not being able to see well enough to get an angle if it showed up. But I thought about it because sometimes your head goes to the truck when everything else gets too heavy. That's where the radio is. That's where the box with more ammunition is. That's where the road back to everything that makes sense begins. 4 miles. I opened my eyes. The cabin was quiet. The fire was low. The smell of fur had gotten into everything. The wood, my clothes, the air itself inside that closed space. and I'd grown so used to it that I had to concentrate to separate what was left over from before and what was a fresh signal. I concentrated. It wasn't a fresh signal. The smell was static, soaked in, no variation indicating something close by. I picked up the notebook and looked at what I'd written. The pattern of time between appearances had shifted after the shot. Before, the intervals had been predictable within a range. Now it had gone outside that range. Either it was farther away than before, recovering, or it was stopped somewhere nearby without moving, which was different from being far away, and worse than being far away. I put the notebook away. The fire needed wood. I stood up, went to the back room door, opened it slowly. Total darkness inside, the smell of old wood and dust. I went in, left the door ajar, moved from memory toward where I'd seen the wood pile against the wall. Grabbed 3 pieces without making noise, went back to the main room, pulled the back door shut, put the wood in the fireplace. The fire came up a little. The room got brighter for a moment, shadows pulling back into the corners again, and I swept the perimeter with my eyes. Walls, windows, door, the way I'd done hundreds of times that night. Everything quiet. I stood looking at the front window for a while, at the closed shutter, at the gap in the lower right corner. I'd looked through at it more than once that night. Nothing in the gap, just darkness outside and cold coming in thin. I went back to my spot between the fireplace and the side window, sat on the floor again, shotgun across my lap, and waited for what I knew was coming. It came back through the roof. I didn't hear it arrive. The first sign was the weight, a pressure distributed across the wood above my head, slow, as if it were laying its whole body against the roof rather than stepping onto it. The kind of contact that maximizes surface area and minimizes sound. I stood looking up as if I could see through the boards, tracking the weight shift slowly from the right edge toward the center. The cabin roof has a low pitch, not steep enough to make movement difficult for something that knows how to keep its balance, and it knew. That was clear from the way the weight distributed. Not the uncontrolled sliding of an animal that's lost traction, but the methodical advance of something choosing where to place each point of support. I raised the shotgun upward. I knew it wouldn't do any good. The roof wood is thicker than the side walls with a layer of rafters inside, and I had no angle. Shooting upward inside an enclosed space is the kind of decision you make when you have no other options left, and I still had others. But my arm went up on its own anyway, the body responding before the head, and I held there for a moment, shotgun pointed at the ceiling, listening to its weight move up there with a calm that dismissed everything I was trying to feel as control of the situation. I lowered the gun. I moved to the center of the room. From the center I had an angle on the door, both windows, and both side walls. No angle upward, but from the center I could move in any direction faster than from the corners. It was the best possible position for the worst possible scenario, which was the roof giving way. It stopped in the middle of the roof. I knew because the weight shift stopped directly above me. I stood under that weight for a stretch of time I can't measure. The wood was working, not giving, not yet, but talking. The thin groaning of a structure under load it wasn't built to carry. The central beam, which had already taken damage from a heavy winter years back, was bearing the most of it. I looked at the beam. There was a lengthwise crack I hadn't noticed when I'd checked the cabin before dark, or had noticed and not thought much of. I was thinking of it now. It wasn't new, it was old. But old and already open is different from old and intact when you put weight on top of it. It moved again. Not toward the edge. It shifted to the side, over the front window, and stopped there. I heard its breathing coming down through the gap of the fireplace flue, a sound that shouldn't have carried through there but did. The heavy, wet breathing coming from above as if the cabin were a duct. I stepped away from the fireplace. I went to the left wall, the farthest from the front window, and stood with my back against it watching. The central beam was above me and above the door at the same time. If the roof gave at the point where it was standing, it would give over the front window and likely pull part of the side structure with it. I've seen what happens when a central beam goes in a small building. It's not gradual, it's fast, and it's total. I thought about the 4 shells. No, 5. Still 5. I'd recounted, and it was 5. My head kept getting the simple math wrong, and it bothered me more than it should have, as if the mistake with the numbers was a sign of something larger giving way inside. The weight on the roof shifted toward the front edge. I heard it come down. Not a jump, not a drop. A controlled descent along the side of the cabin, hands and feet finding purchase in the outer wood, the weight transferring gradually from the roof to the front wall and then to the ground. The sound of its feet touching the soil came through, muffled but clear, and then the footsteps, and then the silence before the smell, which hit strong through the front shutter less than 30 seconds later. It was out front again. I went to the gap. I needed to see where it was before choosing a position. I crouched down, pressed my eye to the gap in the lower corner of the shutter, and it was less than 3 feet from the window facing me, looking directly at the gap. I didn't move. It held still for a long time. Longer than the other times, head tilted slightly to the right, its eyes. I could see the eyes now, at that distance, with the firelight throwing some light through the shutter, fixed on the gap where my eye was. There was no agitation in that look. There was the same weight I'd felt in its hands moving along the shutter hours earlier, the same quality of attention that didn't belong to a hungry animal, but to something filing away what it saw for later use. I didn't fire. Shooting now, with the shutter between us, would blow my position and probably wouldn't result in a clean hit. I needed an open gap, controlled distance, it inside the right angle. I held my breath and stayed still. It dropped its gaze from the gap. It moved slowly down to the lower section of the shutter, where the wood was most rotten, and laid its palm there. No pressure yet, just contact, as if measuring temperature or thickness through the wood. It held like that for a while. Then it pulled its hand back, stepped away, and stood in the same spot, now looking at the whole window rather than the gap. I backed away from the shutter. I went to my spot between the fireplace and the side window and stood there, shotgun up, listening. Its footsteps went right, circling slowly, moving to the side. Stopped near the hole the wooden crate was blocking. I heard the crate shift. It wasn't yanked, it was nudged. Testing the resistance, finding out there was something on the inside pushed up against the hole. New information it hadn't had before climbing onto the roof. It held there for a moment, its hand probably in the hole again, and then the footsteps resumed, heading toward the back. I stayed where I was, listening to it work the full perimeter one more time, thinking that the roof had been reconnaissance, that going up there wasn't an attempt to get in. It was to see the cabin from above, to understand the structure from an angle it hadn't used yet. And now it had. Middle of the night. Maybe later. The wood I'd grabbed from the back room was almost gone, and the cold inside the cabin had reached a level I could feel in my knees, my back, my hands that had been gripping the shotgun for hours without letting go. Not the kind of cold that kills you fast. The kind that stiffens everything slowly, that makes every movement cost more, that gets to your head last and does the most damage when it gets there. I kept moving. Not much. Not enough to make the kind of noise that would change anything outside, but enough to keep the blood moving in my legs. 3 steps left, 3 steps right, inside the center of the room. Not getting close to the windows, not taking my eyes off the perimeter. A man who stays still in the cold too long starts making bad decisions. I've seen it happen with new hunters on winter camps. The body cools down, the head cools with it, and suddenly the idea of going out, of moving, of doing anything that breaks the weight starts to seem reasonable when it isn't. I wasn't going to make that mistake. I thought about other bad nights I'd spent in the woods. I had a few that deserved the name. One winter in Montana, about 15 years ago, a storm that tore down my camp in the middle of the night, and I spent 6 hours waiting for daylight, huddled under a downed pine with a soaked sleeping bag. Once in Oregon with a client who twisted his ankle 12 miles from the vehicle, and we had to stay the night where we were, because he couldn't walk and I wasn't leaving him alone. One night right here in the Bitterroots, years before I knew this cabin, lost for about 3 hours on a stretch with no trail before I found the creek and got my bearings. None of them were like this. It wasn't the discomfort that made this night different. Not the cold or the waiting or the tight space. It was what was outside. Every other bad night had a logic I understood. Storm, accident, navigation error. Those were situations inside a universe that made sense. where the rules I'd learned still meant something. This night was outside that universe, and the distance between what I knew and what I was dealing with was the real weight I was carrying alongside the cold and the exhaustion. It stayed quiet for a long stretch after the last perimeter walk. Not the same quiet as the earlier interval, which had the quality of absence, of something that had gone away. This silence had presence. I knew it was somewhere out there close by still, and that certainty without concrete evidence was the kind of thing the mind normally rejects. And that night, I couldn't reject it because the night had taught me to trust it. I went to the notebook. I looked at what I'd written. Appearance pattern, points of contact, responses to stimulus, the change after the shot. I added the roof, the controlled descent, the time it had stood over the front window, the hand at the hole after coming down. I looked at all of it like it was data from a normal hunt, like I might find the next move in there. I didn't find it. The problem was simple and had no good solution. I knew more about it than I had when the night started, but what I knew gave me no advantage. I knew it learned fast. I knew it wasn't in any hurry. I knew the shot hadn't driven it off. I knew it had mapped the cabin from every angle, including from above. What I knew was an inventory of my situation getting worse, not a way out of it. I put the notebook away. The fire was low again. There was more wood in the back room, I knew that, but the idea of going in there again, of leaving the center of the room for any reason, weighed differently now than it had before. The roof had changed something. Before, I'd been worried about the walls and the door. Now I had the roof too, and the beam with the crack I wasn't going to stop thinking about until this night was over. I went for wood. I opened the back door, stepped into the dark, went from memory to the pile. About 5 pieces left. I took 3, went back to the main room, pulled the door shut. The fire came up when I put them in. The light swelled for a moment, and I used that moment to check the full perimeter one more time. The shadow was on the front shutter. I don't know when it had arrived. It was there when the light rose enough for me to see. The shutter blocking the whole silhouette except the top edge of the head and the shoulders, which rose above the height of the window. It was facing the cabin, still, not doing anything. I stood still too. We held like that for a stretch of time I can't measure. The fire crackling behind me, the cold coming in through the gaps, the shadow on the shutter not moving. I thought about what it was doing, not pressing on the wood, not testing the structure, not scouting a new point. It was presence, standing outside a lit window long enough for the man on the inside to know you're there and not be able to do a thing about it. I knew it was there. I couldn't do a thing about it. Shooting through the shutter at that distance might connect, might not. And if it didn't, I'd be down to 3 shells, and it would have the information that I'd fired blind. Not worth it. The shadow moved. It didn't leave. It shifted to the side slowly, sliding out of the front window's frame and moving toward the right side. I heard the footsteps stop near the hole. The wooden crate shifted again, more than before, pushed from outside with more force than the last time. I went to that wall. I stood on the inside with the shotgun raised, 6 feet from the hole, listening to the crate working against the pressure from outside. The wood around the hole was groaning, the boards next to the one that had blown out earlier flexing against their nails. The pressure stopped. Footsteps heading to the back. I stayed where I was, shotgun aimed at the hole, listening to it move to the back wall. I heard hands on the wood back there, lower than the other times near the baseboard, finding a point it hadn't tested before. The beam above my head groaned once, by itself, with nothing on top of it. Just the wood working in the cold. I knew that. But the shoulder holding up the shotgun didn't loosen until the sound stopped. The back wall gave first, not at the baseboard where I'd been hearing the hands working. Higher up in the middle third, a section I hadn't been watching closely enough because it was away from the spot it had been testing most often. I learned right then that frequency isn't the same as intent. It had been teaching me to look one place while it prepared another. The board came out with a dry crack, smaller than the side wall had made because the wood in the back was older and more brittle. The kind that doesn't resist but doesn't fight either. It just goes. The gap that opened was bigger than the one on the side, nearly 2 feet wide from the middle third up almost to the top, irregular at the edges. splinters of old wood falling inward and outward at the same time. I turned toward the back. Its hand came through the gap immediately, but differently than before. Not slow, not testing. It came in hard and went straight for the upper edge of the hole, the fingers closing around the wood up there, and it pulled. The board above that section gave all at once. The gap opened to nearly 3 feet high, and I was backing toward the center of the room when the right side wall exploded. Not slow pressure, impact. The wooden crate I'd propped against the hole flew across the room, hit the opposite wall, and went down. The section that had been weakened since the first breach gave all at once. The board holding the adjacent ones went with it, and the gap that opened on the side was wide enough to fit a torso and shoulders through without having to crouch much. 2 openings, at the same time, back wall and right side, wall and... I stood in the center of the room for a second that lasted too long, the shotgun swinging from one gap to the other, my head calculating angle and distance and what I knew about how it moved and which way it would come in first, and at what height and how long I'd have before it was standing upright on the inside. I chose the back, not through complete logic. It was faster than logic. The back gap was bigger. Entering through there required less maneuvering, and I'd already seen the hand inside. I turned toward the back, stepped back twice to get distance, raised the shotgun level with the gap, and waited. It came in through the side, not the back. I'd committed to the back and it came through the side, and the second I lost swinging from one gap to the other was the second it was already inside, still bent from the low entry, straightening up, and I fired before I had a clean angle because there was no more time to wait for a clean angle. The first shot caught the shoulder and neck. I saw the impact, saw its body take the recoil of the hit and step back half a pace with the force, but not fall, not stop, just absorb it and straighten up completely and look at me from a height that felt impossible inside the cabin, its head nearly brushing the central beam, its eyes finding mine with that same attention I'd learned to recognize over the course of the night. I fired again. Closer this time, less than 5 feet. The second shot went high into the chest, and this time it went backward. Not a controlled fall. The body genuinely yielding to the impact, the knees buckling, the weight going back and sideways, the right hand grabbing the edge of the gap it had just come through to keep from going all the way down. It held there for a moment, half standing, half propped against the wall, breathing coming out in fast, heavy bursts, dark blood running down through the fur on its chest. I didn't move in. I stepped back 2 more paces, reloaded with the shells I had left in my pocket. 2, I had 2, and stood with the shotgun aimed at it waiting. It straightened up slowly, not all the way. The posture was different from the whole night, right shoulder lower, weight shifted to the left leg. But it was standing, and the eyes still carried the same weight as before, the same presence that didn't belong to an animal at the edge of its strength, but to something reassessing the situation. I looked at it. It looked at me. The fireplace was throwing orange light across everything. Across it, across the blown-out walls, across my own breath condensing in the cold that now poured in unblocked through both gaps. I was seeing it fully, all of it inside my cabin for the only time that night, and its size in the enclosed space was different from anything I'd processed through gaps and cracks. Bigger, more real. The kind of real you keep yourself from thinking about too hard while it's happening, because thinking too hard shuts you down. I didn't think. When it moved, it was fast. Faster than I expected from an animal carrying 2 shots, and the third shell went into the center of its chest when it was already less than 3 feet from me. The impact drove it back, its hand swept across my left shoulder as it went, and the force of that sent me into the fireplace wall. I caught myself against the wall beside it with my arm extended, the heat coming through my vest, and I straightened up. It was on the floor. Still breathing, chest rising and falling unevenly, eyes open, head turned in my direction. It wasn't getting up. I stood there with the last shell in the chamber, left shoulder hurting in a way I was going to feel for weeks, looking at it on the floor of my cabin and waiting for what came next. The chest rose one more time, then stopped. The chest didn't rise again. I stood watching long enough to be certain, not the rushed certainty of someone who wants it to be true, but the certainty of someone who's seen enough dead animals to recognize when a body lets go for good. The breathing stops, the musculature releases in a specific way. There's a different quality of weight to something that was alive a moment before. I knew that, but I didn't go near it. I stayed where I was with the last shell in the chamber, my left shoulder throbbing, the cold pouring in through both gaps without anything to stop it, and I watched. The fire was low, the orange light fading, and the shadows inside the cabin grew until it on the floor became a large, dark mass that I kept monitoring, even knowing what I'd seen. I must have stood like that for an hour, maybe more. My knees stiffened, my feet went numb. My shoulder moved from throbbing to a more solid, constant pain that ran up the side of my neck. I didn't move. When you have one shell and you're not completely sure, you don't move. The fire went out on its own at some point. I was in total darkness then, guided only by what I heard and what I knew about the space around me. Its breathing didn't come back. No movement on the floor, no sound suggesting recovery. Its smell had gotten into everything, soaked into the wood, into my clothes, into the air itself. Impossible to use as an indicator of presence or absence now. The first light came through the gaps in the walls. Not dawn all at once. The light that comes before dawn. That gray, cold thing that doesn't illuminate properly but gives shape back to the world. Enough to make out the back of the floor and the side wall and the open gap between them. Enough to see that the floor where it had fallen was empty. It wasn't there anymore. It took me a moment to process. I swept the whole space with my eyes. The back room with its door half open. The corners of the main room. The entire floor. Nothing. A blood trail from the spot where it had fallen leading toward the side gap, dragged, not footsteps. It hadn't walked out. It had dragged itself out. Which meant the hour I'd stood still in the dark was the hour it had used to leave. 3 shots. 2 in the chest, 1 in the shoulder. And it had walked away. I went out through the side. The cold outside was a different level after a night sealed in. It hit my face like water. The sun hadn't come up yet. The sky was that deep gray that comes before real light, and the trees were dark silhouettes against it. The forest was quiet the same way it had been when I'd arrived the night before. Except this quiet I recognized. It was the normal quiet of early morning, the kind that exists before the birds start. I found the blood trail on the ground. Far more blood than I expected to see. Wide, dark patches in the pine needles, an irregular trail heading into the thick brush east of the cabin, drag marks on both sides where its arms had pushed its body forward. It had gone a long way with that, which told me more about what it was than everything I'd seen all night. I followed. Not running, not careless. I went the way I go on any tracking. Slow enough not to lose the trail, fast enough not to give too much time. The last shell was in the chamber, finger off the trigger, eyes split between the blood on the ground and the woods ahead. The trail went into the thick brush and continued for about 200 yards. Irregular at first, then more drag than ever. The distance between marks getting shorter. It was slowing down. The blood loss was collecting on what the shots had started, and the dense brush didn't do any favors to something moving large and heavy and close to the ground. I found it in a small clearing. It was on its side, its broad flank turned upward, breathing again. Shallow, labored, the chest barely moving. It wasn't dead. It was getting there. Its head turned when I came close. Its eyes found mine. The same attention as before, but different now. Not the calculated wait of the whole night. Not the presence of something that's learning and waiting. It was something else. I can't name it. I've never seen it in an animal before, and I don't know if what I saw was what I think it was, so I won't name it. I got close enough not to miss. I fired. The sound of the shot spread through the woods and came back in one echo, then was gone. The forest went quiet again. The birds hadn't started yet. The sun hadn't come up yet, and I stood in the clearing with the shotgun in my hand and my breath condensing in the morning cold, looking at it on the ground until I had the kind of certainty that doesn't leave room for debate. Then I turned my back. I started walking toward the creek, 4 miles to the truck, the road back. Whatever came after that. The shoulder was hurting in a way that was going to need attention. The cabin was destroyed, and what had happened inside it was the kind of thing I didn't know yet how I was going to carry. The forest woke up as I walked. The birds first, one by one, then the small movement in the branches, the rustle of a squirrel, the sound of the creek growing as I got closer. The forest going back to what it had always been, indifferent to what had happened that night, moving forward the way it always does. I knew these woods. I'd spent 50 years learning every living thing in them. I knew now that I didn't know everything.